patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 128 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me for this interview episode. Once again, I want to thank our Patreon supporters so much for their incredible help with keeping this podcast going, and I just want to really encourage all of you to consider becoming a Patreon supporter. There is a brand new feature that I'm introducing starting today, which is that if you are a Patreon level of $10 or more, so the Alexander Hamilton membership or higher, you will receive a free Friends and Fellow Citizens mug. This is a wonderful deal to be able to get your hands on a limited item. We've got more mugs, of course, coming in stock, but if you want to get your hands on the latest designs and the first batch of Friends and Fellow Citizens mugs, make sure you can go to our Patreon page, which is down in the show notes below. Once again, $10 more, you get a free Friends and Fellow Citizens mug. Today's guest is Dr. Aileen Teague. Dr. Aileen Teague is an assistant professor in the Department of International Affairs at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Service. She previously held a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. She is also a fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the Mosbacher Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy. Teague earned her PhD in history from Vanderbilt University in 2018. Born in Cologne, Panama, she traveled the world as part of a military family and served in the U.S. Marine Corps from 2006 to 2014. She teaches classes on U.S. history and relations with Latin America and serves as faculty coordinator for the Latin America Concentration. She coordinates The Other Side of the Border, Ties That Bind and Issues That Divide, a speaker series highlighting practitioner perspectives on Latin America. Her book, Dirty War on Drugs, The United States, Mexico, and the Origins of Militarized Policing, 1969 to 2000, is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. Teague's work has been published in journals including Diplomatic History and the Social History of Alcohol and Drugs. Her research has received support from organizations including Fulbright, the American Historical Association, the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego, where she served as a visiting fellow. Her opinion pieces have appeared in venues including Time and The Washington Post. This conversation will be focused on drug policy and illicit drug activity, and I hope that we'll be able to see more episodes with these different perspectives and having that conversation, as we always do on Friends and Fellow Citizens. So I look forward to hearing about Dr. Teague's perspectives on these important topics. All right, well, let's welcome Dr. Aileen Teague to our program. Dr. Teague, thank you so much for joining Friends and Fellow Citizens today.
It's good to be with you, Sherman.
Well, today we're talking a very, very important and specific subject here, and I think this is something that I hope we'll have a lot more discussions about, but I really want to have this episode to really set that stage for this future conversation. So let's get right into a bit about your background. So I've, of course, read your bio, but tell us a little bit about how you got into your career in teaching right now at A&M, and really just a little bit about the research interests that gotten you to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I teach in the International Affairs Department at the Bush School, and I mainly focus on courses having to do with U.S. foreign policy history and specifically U.S. Latin America relations. And I mean, just in terms of my own personal interests, I'm was born in Panama. I also served in the U.S. military and lived on a number of military outposts outside of the United States. So the history of how U.S. Bases were created, how U.S. influence was sort of spread and maintained. I mean, that has always been a fundamental research interest of mine. And I'm a historian of of U.S. foreign relations, and I think that there's no better way to be able to apply that history than to be able to work in a foreign policy school like the Bush School, where I am now, where they bring in. I mean, I'm in a department that's interdisciplinary, and we have a couple of historians, and I think that looking at the larger picture of U.S. policies is an integral part of understanding the road ahead. And so to kind of put a bow on sort of my background and how I got to where I am, I just think that there's certain kind of personal interests that influence me, having to do with my background, but also I think being at a policy school, particularly a place like the Bush School, is the ideal place to be able to be a historian that is looking at the past, but also trying to see how the past bears on the future. And I mean, one of my research interests, my primary research interest, is sort of the history of U.S. interventionism. And I mean, there's lots of ways in which interventionism takes place. It takes place obviously more forcefully in a U.S. invasion of like Iraq or something like that, or U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, which we've seen more recently. But there's also ways in which it takes place a bit more subtly. And one way in which the United States has intervened in other countries, especially in Latin America, is through drug control. While agencies like the Drug Enforcement Administration or the DEA are active, and at times have they have sort of legal authorities outside of U.S. borders. I mean, it's not considered this sort of textbook interventionism. What the DEA and other U.S. counter-narcotics actors do in countries from Mexico on down throughout the Western Hemisphere. And the way in which these sorts of arrangements were established is an important part of my research, and how we understand the legacies of Mexico's so-called drug war and drug violence vis-a-vis U.S. involvement and the United States co-opting and sort of coercing at times Mexico to adopt its anti-drug policies.
Well, I really appreciate what you've shared about your interests and really the significance, once again, of that transnational approach and understanding the foreign relations and the foreign impacts of U.S. policy and interventionism. Just kind of more on more of a personalized question here, which is clearly, the issue of drugs and drug addiction, which we'll be covering today. It's such a personal issue for so many Americans, unfortunately, because you and I and the listeners here have probably heard and seen all these reports about just the tragic nature of what happens when people are caught up in illicit drugs, and not to mention the health effects and how it's really affected communities across the nation. From your perspective, when you see these kind of stories and all that, and there's so many out there, what are the kind of thoughts that go in your mind in terms of kind of that motivation for you to keep researching these interests and ensuring that more people can understand what is at play here in this really tragic national international emergency?
That's an excellent question, Sherman. I mean, I think on the one hand, there are segments of the American public that have experiences, whether it's a family member or a friend with drug addiction, but also at the same time, there are segments of the American population who have absolutely no experience with drug addiction, right? And so they don't have the sort of motivation to have a say, to critique, or to really kind of engage with what the United States government's policies have been in drug control, both domestically and abroad. And I would argue that that's one of the reasons why this so-called war on drugs that many people have said in the United States have said is a failure has been allowed to go on for so long. I mean, so what do I think when I hear about these tragedies of drug addiction? I mean, this has been going on for multiple decades, and there's been different waves of drug addiction in the United States. The most recent one that has really been catapulted by U.S. Americans' addictions to prescription opioids like OxyContin in the late 1990s, and the fact that there's many people that are very angry in which the ways in which pharmaceutical companies have exercised power over Americans and their health. But the offshoot of these problems have led to addiction of illicit drugs like heroin and now, most recently fentanyl. And with these synthetic opioids, it becomes a lot more difficult for the United States, for U.S. anti-drug agencies to track these compounds when there's a very subtle switch. And that is sort of the difference between detection and non-detection of some of these substances crossing U.S. borders. I mean, to kind of wrap it up in this question specifically, and I can talk about more specific aspects of this very large question if you would like, but I think for a while, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, where a lot of the research for my current book, which will be out next year, begins, is this question of harm reduction, right? And with the many Americans, even just with methadone maintenance treatment, I mean, they were against that. I mean, and this is the idea of using what is an opioid to eliminate an addiction to another opioid, which is heroin. I mean, and some Americans have been fundamentally opposed to this harm reduction measure because, again, it's just substituting one drug for another, albeit a drug that allows someone who is addicted to heroin or another substance to live a productive life. And I think what a lot of Americans don't necessarily realize and track is the fact that the more intensive drug addiction gets, the larger harm reduction measures will have to be, right? And so, I mean, whereas it was a relatively small amount of methadone maintenance required to maintain heroin addictions during the early 1970s, the amount of methadone required to maintain or someone who has an addiction to fentanyl is significantly larger. And I mean, what I'm saying here is, at some point, the United States or the American public is going to have to really kind of have a reckoning with some of its drug policies and harm reduction measures, because as these sort of epidemics, opioid epidemics, if you want to call them that, gets worse, the types of actions that the government and public health officials are going to have to take are going to have to be more intensive. And the fact that some people continue to be, I mean, even today, some people continue to be opposed or they're heavily critical of some of these methods like harm reduction. And they don't want to accept the fact that drug addiction can't be completely eliminated. We can make it better. We can do our best to kind of give people respect and make progress on the problem, but we're not going to completely eliminate it. And so there just needs to be a different way of thinking with respect to drug addiction, or else what's going to be required in measures like harm reduction and other kind of policy objectives are going to have to get a lot more intensive, more so than they are now with supervised injection sites, even legalized drug use, and that sort of thing.
Well, I appreciate that you've really made that calling for the United States to have a reckoning, and it's absolutely true that I don't think we've had really a significant reckoning as big of a shakeup of realizing how, first of all, the extent of the problem, but also the willingness to fight against it. I mean, this is I hear all these stories all the time, and it's really sad. We'll get to some of those policy solutions later on, but I'd like to get back to kind of what you offered to discuss. Some of those major issues of that sort of the primary issues that you think are driving this crisis. What sort of things are you seeing that are accelerating or at least accelerating the problem or hindering the solutions to overcome, to ensure that especially youth, especially a lot of young people, that are hindering these efforts to reverse course on this addiction?
I think at times the solutions become complicated because the causes themselves are complicated and they are entangled in a lot of other issues that we are dealing with in the U.S. public at the moment. And I'll give you an example of that. I mean, right now, many drug traffickers from Mexico are using social media forums like Snapchat and other forums to be able to connect with youths in U.S. cities and get their product to them. I think just recently I was talking to a journalist colleague of mine with the Dallas Morning News who was writing about this very topic, and I mean it was about these issues that we're finding overdoses among high school students, and then kind of had no idea how it is that that these students, I mean these kids, get access to drugs from Mexican drug cartels. And so, I mean, I think that what I'm saying kind of more broadly is the fact that some of these other issues in terms of like the 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 control and the power and the influence of big tech, I mean, they roll in and they compound some of these issues, such as youth drug addiction and even just drug addiction of your normal American adult. And so I think that going forward, and I haven't read a lot about this or really speculated a lot about this, but right now we're having this reckoning with AI and the role it's going to have in the classroom, the role it's going to have in different aspects of our society. And right now, as it stands, a member of the Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel can leverage social media in order to get the cartel's product to ordinary communities here in the United States. And I just wonder what are the ways and outlets in which other developing problems in other spheres are going to enhance Mexican cartel's ability to get their product throughout the United States, likely without any sort of necessity for them to actually enter the United States, which then, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, sort of obviates the need for any sort of intensive border security measures or border walls, because that's not even going to be relevant in a case like this. And so I think that to kind of wrap it up here, I mean, I think it's important that we see the developing sort of the landscape of drug addiction in the United States and how youths and adults who are addicted to drugs get their hands on product. I mean, we really kind of examine the ways in which technology and other resources that we utilize might actually help in the traffic of drugs into the United States.
Well, you mentioned the border, and I think that's a great segue into kind of some of those policies. And we hear so much, I think, about the border, right, and about the drug smuggling and all that, and certainly that's a whole episode, a podcast episode to discuss, of course. But when we're seeing these kind of technological advances that in a way are kind of going around these border walls, like literally, because since we're talking about social media with that technology, how do you think that's going to complicate the efforts that the US and Mexico have to work on to stem these issues? And I guess to just elaborate a bit further, there's so limited information out there, for the public, including myself. You're obviously a lot more well read on this than I am, but it just seems like it's almost like, well, feels like it takes two to tango, but it kind of feels like, well, we're not so sure kind of where these sort of issues are lying. Is it more of like the Mexican authorities not being able to respond or enforce law? Is it the U.S. not doing enough at the border? How do you kind of see that relationship as we see this cross-border illicit drug trafficking going on right now?
Obviously, there's very important connections between the enforcement side and supply control and dismantling the drug trade or efforts to do so, and connections between that and reducing domestic drug addiction. But generally, I see those two things in separate realms. I mean, I think that your first question or not your first question, but the question two questions ago that you posed to me about drug addiction facing Americans today. I mean, I think that that's a separate effort that really kind of needs to be escalated here in the United States, and that will naturally kind of have impacts on what sorts of measures enforcement actors on both sides of the border need to take. And so obviously these types of developing technologies are going to make enforcement a lot more complicated. I mean, and you can kind of go down a rat hole in which enforcement is going to be the only solution to reducing U.S. Or Americans and their addiction to drugs. But I think that more and more we're seeing that that enforcement alone is not going to be able to fix the problem. And as much as people kind of articulate that, or politicians, our leaders articulate that in our rhetoric, we still have yet to make meaningful changes in reducing the levels of enforcement, such that that demand reduction is given substantial attention over supply control. And I mean, I think that we have a lot of work to do. And I'm not saying that there doesn't need to be any enforcement. Obviously, that's going to be important, but enforcement alone isn't going to fix the problem. And indeed, it makes it substantially worse.
Now let's go into a bit of the Latin America political stability element, because I just want to try to see if I can get an understanding of some of the impacts that you have seen in your research on U.S. war of drugs policies, but more importantly, I think what can you tell us about not just the impacts of of some of these policies, but also how does Latin American political stability affect the U.S.'s effort to crack down on drugs and illicit activity? If you can bridge that connection between those two, because that's something I think all Americans probably would be like, yeah, what's the connection, with this and in the homeland? So if you can talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think we have to look at this question from multiple perspectives. I mean, because you have people that want to, I mean, here in the United States, very recently saying that they want to use military force against Mexico and or Mexico's drug cartels. And there's this sort of perception in the United States that that um, that U.S. That instability south of the U.S. Mexico border is somehow going to affect U.S. security interests, and that's very true. But I think that what we see less of in the public is the fact that U.S. policies around drug control, and I mean, there's a kind of a whole history there around other issues around extractive economies and types of relationships the United States had with its Latin American partners during the Cold War, for example, has created instability as well. I mean, so I think that what I'm trying to say here is that it's important that we ask this question both ways, right? How has the United States, how is the United States security interest affected by the instability in Latin American countries, but also how U.S. actions over many decades have caused instability in Latin American countries. And I think drug control specifically is a way in which U.S. policies have over time, especially in countries like Mexico and Colombia, have made stability and public safety issues worse. And I'm not just saying that the United States has directly intervened in a certain, sense, but the fact that the United States has chosen military and policing actors as their preferred partners for executing drug control has created a host of problems at different moments in time in which the military is policing drugs, policing civilians for drugs, and committing human rights violations at certain moments in time. And so I am more interested, I think, in the ways in which the U.S. policies have made Latin American countries more unstable. Because I think that more broadly speaking, and I think this is also getting to the question that you're asking, Sherman, is that the United States, I mean, we have the United States, we're very kind of attached to a war in Ukraine right now and what NATO is going to do to support it. And Latin America really kind of only comes up, it bubbles up when something really wrong, when something really bad happens, right? When there's thousands of people in a caravan at the U.S. border, when there's a lot of kind of heated rhetoric exchanged between politicians on border security or immigration issues. But in general, compared to other theaters that the United States engages in, they don't really have a coherent strategy for helping to promote the health of the Western Hemisphere. They do things, and there's certain kind of agencies and political actors that are dedicated to this endeavor at certain points in time, but it's not cohesive and it's not enduring. And then when these crises pop up in the region, I mean, we wonder why our sort of short-sighted, very quick measures don't work. And so, I mean, I think that to get to the essence of, of your question, it's not just about Latin American instability on its own. I mean, there's a much broader history of US entanglements in this instability. Indeed, the US's promotion of this instability that comes back and has come back to haunt Washington in many senses, come back and haunt border officials. And there needs to be a longer, more enduring solution to promote the health, I'll just call it the health of the Western Hemisphere.
I appreciate what you said about the elements of these consequences on Latin American countries, and why do you think this has continued for so long? What sort of driving forces do you think, whether it's within the American political system or maybe somewhere else in Latin America, what do you think has kept these policies going for so long? Even though, as you pointed out, there's been a lot of these bad consequences on instability. Is it kind of going back to the combination of like, because there's so many causes, there's also a lot of different interests or different things that have affected or have kept policies, or our U.S. policy relatively the same, or the kind of the similar approach?
I think it's a mix of neglect, a lack a lack of willingness to change the status quo. And also, I think that there's racial and ethnic attitudes, whether or not we want to admit it or not, that have shaped U.S. relations with Latin America as sort of this um, other, in a sense, in the Western Hemisphere. And so, I'm not saying that no changes have been made, right? I'm saying that more substantial changes could be made. And I think that if you ask some people, maybe sort of Euro centered or Middle East centered policymakers, if the United States has changed their policies towards Latin America for the better, they'd probably say yes. I mean, because in the post war era, we don't see as in the post Cold War era, we don't see as many military interventions or CIA sponsored coups as there was in Guatemala in 1954 or 1989 in Panama, or I mean, there's or Chile in the 1970s. But I mean, I think that in some ways, I mean, U.S. Southern Command and and other military organizations from the United States that are involved in Latin America have in some ways been a little bit gun shy in the post Cold War era about their involvement in Latin America and security issues and in other issues. And I think that U.S. military actors, for the most part, I mean, their MO is to participate in kind of combat type operations. And I think that there's a lot of ways in which not only the military, but other organizations can focus on more rebuilding type efforts in Latin America. But I think that I would say that for the most part, the United States' posture towards or progress in developing a regional strategy is more stagnant at the moment. We're sort of running in place, afraid to engage in the type of engagement that the United States engaged in the region in the past, especially during the Cold War, but then sort of a bit apprehensive and not creative about the types of ways in which the United States can develop a better strategy for the region that's not necessarily focused on military force, but more of a rebuilding of the region.
As part of your research, and my understanding is that you kind of look at some of the histories in Mexico and how that kind of relates to this larger issue of U.S. Mexico, transnational issues. What sort of factors do these local histories, if I may say so, like in Mexico or in any other country in Latin America, what sort of factors do those play in the instability? Because I think one of the things at least one of the takeaways I got from my time at the Bush School is when it comes to foreign policy or anything, it's sometimes it's kind of hard to separate what what was caused by a country that intervened and what was caused by like historical and sociological differences and factions and conflicts. So how much of those histories do you think are also impacting the instability elements of Latin American countries?
Yeah, in short, a significant part of it is local, national, internal, however it is that you want to um, define it. I'm by no means saying that the United States is solely responsible for instability. I mean, it's definitely looking at it from both ends of the coin, which is what which is what I do in my work, and which is what I was trying to sort of impress on you, because I think that the more dominant or the more common trend is for people to just see Latin American issues as solely a product of local, national, internal factors, right? I mean, I think that that's the whole premise for a border wall, for example. That people, I mean, Governor Abbott, the last time I checked here in this wonderful state of Texas, I mean, has his own border wall website that's raised millions of dollars, right? And people still continue to add money to that. I mean, because they think that if you erect a border wall, you'll keep out all of these issues having to do with local instability in other nations like Mexico and countries south of Mexico. I mean, so I think that, believe you me, I mean, most of the way in which US policymakers see Latin American challenges or security challenges is because they believe that most of what is motivating those challenges is local. And I would say that part of that is true. I think that where I'm coming from in my work and my research is that we have to kind of take into account both, and a lot of time, both motivations, both external and internal. And U.S. Washington needs to be more aware in which the ways in which and the unintended consequences of its policies and how they make local circumstances worse. Right? I mean, so local circumstances, of course, are super important. Let me give you an example about how, I mean, you have countries where the military has an overwhelming amount of power, right? And so sometimes these militaries would be what we call corrupt. But the fact that Washington empowers some of these institutions and gives them additional military resources gives them a vehicle for gives a vehicle for or gives an opportunity for local circumstances to become worse with respect to violence and instability. I mean, obviously, there's a longer trend in places like Mexico, which I study significantly in my research. Obviously, there are factors in Mexico's political and social history that shape its instability today. But there's also factors that or aspects of this story in which Mexico's social and political issues over the last 100 years have been exacerbated by U.S. policies in Mexico.
Dr. Teague, you make such an important point about the need to look at the internal and external factors, because it seems like nowadays in our divisive politics, it feels like people are only going to see one the internal factors, and the other side is only seeing the external factors. Like one side only blame the United States, right, and the other side only blame local politics. And do you see that kind of division within the political environment where there doesn't seem to be even like maybe at times a realistic look at the consequences of a combination of different factors? Is that something that you're seeing right now in the political environment?
So the question is whether or not I see the divisive political environment here in the United States as blurring or sort of not painting an accurate image of the complexity of some of these policy issues that that are happening throughout Latin America. I mean, absolutely. I don't think anybody would disagree on that fact. I mean, politics itself, in terms of spreading the message, can be tricky sometimes because politicians have to be action oriented, responding to a problem, and depicting the problem as simplistic as possible a lot of times sets them up for success, or it puts them up on a platform for them being able to kind of articulate very easy measurable policy solutions. I mean, but the fact is that when you are, when one is looking at these issues, there's a lot of different angles and complexity. And so I think that regardless of politics and the politics of foreign policy here in the United States, it underscores the importance of endeavors like you're working on, Sherman, with looking at doing. It's incumbent upon the average American citizen to be able to read and step out of the 24-hour news media type spotlight and dig into some of these issues a bit. And I'm not saying that they can do that all the time on every issue, but it just underscores the importance of American citizens' responsibility for understanding some of the complexities outside of politics of some of these most important policy issues that are in the media.
I love what you said. That's the feeling I got from the Bush School, which I think is so fitting, because going back to going back to the issues and focusing on solving problems and this and that, that is something that I got from the Bush School. So I'm glad there's a little bit of that environment that I think the Bush School has very successfully fostered, in my view. It just seems like in the classroom, as you probably understand too, which is you see all these students who are looking at solving these problems, and I don't think there's ever been a day when I felt that it was Democrats versus Republicans or left versus right in these conversations, because it doesn't need to be repeated too often, but clearly this is something that spans so many administrations and Congresses, and I fully believe that we need to have once again that more robust conversation. And Dr. Teague, I want to now move on to one final question, really just about kind of the cultural element. Now, I know this is kind of a bit of this is a less technical question, but one of the things I learned when I was a kid was, don't do drugs, don't do drugs, don't excessively drink, don't do any of these things. It's not trying to condense the problem down to a simple lesson here. But what sort of things in our culture here in America that are, or in, I should say, not just culture, but in education, what sort of things are we lacking in terms of trying to teach that lesson, to prevent people from being addicted to these drugs? It just seems like nowadays, and you can certainly clarify because this is kind of maybe more of your space, but I'm just so concerned, obviously, of people who fall into these kinds of traps, and I wonder if we're doing enough, or even remotely enough, to warn people about these kinds of issues, and particularly you mentioned social media, how to warn young people about these kinds of traps and ways that unfortunately cartels are taking advantage of.
Yeah, I'll be honest in saying that I think that this question might be a bit above my pay grade. If we could kind of crack the code on this question, I think that we might not be having this conversation right now, Sherman. I think that a lot of the issues that are that our society is dealing with right now, on a number of levels, with respect to public health, with respect to the fact that lower income communities have access to certain resources they need to live and to be successful. Looking at the impact and the influence of social media on youth, even just on adults. A lot of the issues that we are dealing with in domestic politics have some sort of link to one's propensity to want to use psychoactive substances. And obviously the demographics and the reasons affecting each demographic is different. But I don't know if there's one thing that we can kind of focus on that would make a sizable amount of impact on addiction in our society. We look back to historical examples of complete abstinence. First Lady Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign during the 1980s. Obviously that was a very kind of concerted effort at eliminating drug addiction from society. But now it's sort of, people make fun of that in a sense, because it seems so ridiculous, the fact that that abstinence could really be the goal in drug addiction. I mean, and now we have more recently, for example, President Obama admitting to smoking marijuana. The attitudes around drugs are a bit more liberal. Meanwhile, there's a lot of changes taking place in our culture, from how we communicate, to how we exchange information, to how we talk about politics, and how we get our information. And addiction and one's propensity to want to consume drugs, is all sort of molded by all of these loose factors. And I don't know, I think it's a combination of factors that we need to kind of look at. Um, and I'm not sure it's any one of them that necessarily points to the fact that we're not training people well enough not to want to go after drugs, or that um, that we're focusing on the wrong things when it comes to educating our youth about drugs. I mean, a lot of these methods have been tried. I mean, but sometimes there's just many different forms of access for drugs. I mean, some people don't even intend to have an addiction to an opioid, but fentanyl is laced in some sort of party drug that they tried to consume. Some have to escape from reality because they don't have any sort of other types of they don't have any other types of solutions or recourses. I mean, economically, socioeconomically. Um, others, it's a mental health issue, that's another sort of focus that increasingly you hear more about in politics, is the importance on um, crafting policies that are respectful of the mental health of others. I mean, there's so many different reasons. And I don't think that you can kind of cut lines in between each of these blocks that I'm talking about. And that's why all of this is sort of, it muddles together in a sense. And I don't know what that's going to look like going forward in terms of education and treatment.
It's certainly even for me, and I couldn't tell you, exactly what sort of things are going to work far better than others. I hopefully there'll be a consideration of a combination of things, like the medicinal side, but also maybe some things that are kind of outside, or at least kind of perceived as outside of this space, like like religious institutions, what their role is, or of schools, or of other groups. It's probably just like a lot of things. It's a multi-level, kind of as probably I've probably heard many times, whole of government sort of approach to. I totally understand. I wholeheartedly agree with you that this is that, especially going back to what you were saying earlier. You cannot look at this as just like one facet, and there's a lot to learn from there. Now, Dr. Teague, let's go into kind of some of the potential solutions or things or ideas that you have to, at the very minimum, raise that reckoning here in America, which is something it's probably kind of the first sort of shock that we need as a society. What kinds of things could you share with us about how we can move away from some of these controversial or destructive policies, and find more ways to at least kind of have more constructive conversations with our peers and our community members, and just others who are interested in solving this problem?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty big question, and I'll answer it in a couple of small parts, and we can talk about specific aspects of my response. But I mean, I think that domestically, decriminalization and having that be part of the policy narrative is really important. I mean, there's been a large prison industrial complex that has been constructed as a result of intensive punitive drug control policies here in the United States since the 1970s. And those have just sort of uh, endured across various presidential administrations. I mean, we're seeing more decriminalized measures come up where there's more of a fine. There's no sort of imprisonment as a result of drug of having possession of some amount of drugs. I mean, that could be different for people that are, of course, trafficking drugs, but not throwing people in jail for small amounts of having marijuana, or other substances that are not super intensive effects. In terms of, I mean, I don't understand your question 100%. So what sorts of changes can be made to drug treatment, and how does that differ from what we talked about before? You know what I mean? Are you talking about moving past the war on drugs? Are you talking about uh, what, I mean, in terms of what more we could do for treatment? Obviously, education is really important. Um, More of a focus on demand reduction and funneling additional government resources towards possibilities for treatment centers and that kind of thing, which are very expensive right now. Of course, moving away from militarized enforcement domestically and overseas. I mean, is that more of what you're looking for with this?
Yes, yes. Like I'm kind of looking more of like what kinds of things could be considered when it comes to like a change in strategy or change if there's some, or I should say, if you can alter some of the strategies that we have right now when it comes to tackling this issue, what sort of things would you add on to that or reform?
Yeah, I mean, probably just those things I said in short. I mean, moving away from militarized policies and additional resources directed towards treatment.
And just the last quick question before we get to kind of the final question of our conversation, which is going back to the divisiveness of our politics. This is may not necessarily just within your research space, but what sort of things would you consider when you see major division between the two parties? What kind of things would you promote to ensure that we have a bit more civic engagement and that we have less of a divisive conversation when it comes to the issues we've talked about today?
That's a complicated question because there's so many different subgroups within the Republican and the Democratic Party that have very different attitudes on drugs and drug consumption. I mean, obviously, you have evangelicals and sort of the far right that have very different ideas about drug consumption as people in the more moderate parts of the conservative party. So, I mean, I don't know that right now that drug issues are something that we kind of throw in for productive bipartisan discourse. But I will say that we have to have a more serious conversation about the distribution of government resources. I mean, especially when the United States is directing so much money to other security objectives. I mean, over time, drug addiction and the ways in which the United States has sought to reduce drug addiction by supply control measures overseas, especially in Latin America, has evolved into a sort of securitized military operated function, right? And so if we're sending a lot of resources to the development of our military, it makes sense that if drug policing and enforcement has become a militarized function, then we should spend money um, on on treatment options and getting a hold of domestic drug demand at home. I mean, in order to sort of reduce the need, in theory, of money that needs to be spent on militarized enforcement overseas. And so, I mean, I said this earlier in our conversation, but it's becoming popular both in the United States and outside of the United States to say that the war on drugs has been a failure. And that's definitely true, but a lot of the military and security relationships that have been established around drug policing and drug enforcement are still very much in play. And there hasn't been any sort of substantial changes made in those relationships. So I think that another question that you had listed on here is about how this manifests in the realm of foreign policy with other countries. And that means, and that this connects to broader things that we talked about earlier in the conversation, in that we need to kind of, especially in Latin America, where I study, we, the United States, need to be able to find more productive ways of working to empower our partners in the region. I mean, so that we're not solely focused on military relationships for decreasing the traffic of drugs, so that people in these countries have other alternatives, and that in turn makes impact on this sort of instability that many U.S. Americans perceive is going on in Latin America. I think more broadly, both in the domestic and foreign policy realm, drug control needs to be less of a function that is punitive, aggressive, prohibitionist, and requires the use of force, less of a function that requires the use of force, and meaning that we should try to move. We're not going to be able to do it completely, but we need to be moving on the continuum in which we're trying to reduce the level of policing and force that has to be done in drug enforcement. And a lot of the work that's being done has to do more with reducing drug demand at home and providing treatment options and reducing the scope of militaries in drug policing.
Well, Dr. Teague, this has been a great conversation. Before we conclude, I'd like to ask you a question that I always ask for our guests, which is reflecting and connecting the topics we discussed or the values we discussed with the values of Washington's farewell address of patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, and civility. Dr. Teague, which one of these values do you think are most pertinent to the sharing that you've given us, and also just the broader conversation of where you like the national discussion on drug addiction and drug trafficking to go in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously this is what we've talked about today. To kind of sum it up, is more along the lines of we've talked about domestic drug addiction, what we see as the opioid crisis more recently, and the detrimental effects that it has had on American society, and the measures both domestically and foreign policy that the U.S. government has taken to try to reduce domestic drug addiction. But I think that from your questions and from some of what I've said in response to them, I mean, there's so many issues that complicate this. I mean, domestic politics, the use of the military, the fact that at times drug addicts, I mean, we didn't specifically talk about this, I mean, but they are sort of scapegoated and they are othered in U.S. society. And I think that to get back to the question about Washington's farewell address, I mean, this problem and the multiple levels and complications of it, and this problem, I mean, drug addiction and how the United States government seeks to reduce it domestically and overseas. I mean, I think that there are so many ways in which it undermines our national unity. And I think that we need to drug addiction should be an issue, I mean, in theory, that is bipartisan. I mean, because it affects all types of people and all types of communities. And I think that, I mean, one really useful experience I had on this is when I was a postdoctoral fellow in Providence at Brown. I taught a course on US drug addiction in which we took students out into the community and they got to see a methadone clinic. They got to interface with people that do rehab and counseling and kind of learn about the different options there were. I mean, because Providence during that time, and this was about 4 years ago, had a really high addiction rate of fentanyl. And I think students in general commented that they were so happy that they kind of left the ivory tower and they went into the community and saw how pervasive these problems were. I mean, it wasn't about political beliefs or socioeconomic background. I mean, it was a shared responsibility. It was a shared problem that affects many people around us, and we don't always know it. And so I think that to look back to some of these values that you're talking about, I mean, it's important that we as a society kind of get around this fact that it affects everyone. And a lot of these values, I mean, whether it's faith spoken of in the religious evangelical sense or just more of like a general spiritual sense, I mean, in order to kind of propel any sort of solutions, I mean, there needs to be a coming together. I mean, there needs to be a broader conversation around some of these issues. Education is a really important part of that, and making sure that people have access to information on the consequences of consuming drugs. But then also this idea of fiscal responsibility and civility is a part of it too, because I think that as we come together, hopefully, and try to come up with better solutions for drug addiction in US society, I mean, it really means grappling with how the government is going to, the types of policy responses that the government is going to take, which for far too long, they have been, I mean, since 1974, I believe it was, the United States has spent um, like triple the amount, I mean, quadruple the amount of money over time on supply control abroad and enforcement methods over domestic demand reduction. And so when we're talking about fiscal responsibility and resource management, it's important that this coming together and this broader conversation that needs to be had really kind of delves into these questions of where it's best to funnel energy and resources in order to at least make this problem better.
Very well said. I love that little story that you shared about bringing the students out in the field. And now that I'm thinking about it, I think it'd be such a great idea for schools across the country to do similar things, to see these kinds of solutions and of issues. Really getting people to see these problems and see these solutions, and hopefully that can generate some more innovation. I think for future leaders and others to come up with different ways of addressing the kinds of things that you talked about. And so, Dr. Teague, I want to thank you so much for coming onto our program. You really have shared quite a bit on some of these complexities, which I really appreciate. And this is the goal of podcasts, is to unveil some of those complexities. And not to mention that, and something, a recurring theme that I heard from you, of course, is the idea of being able to see these different layers and these different internal and external factors, looking at the supply demand elements, right? Not just one or the other. And I hope that we'll on this podcast, we'll continue these conversations, with some others as well who can chime in. But for you, I think to be able to set a foundation, to set some of these ideas and the issues we should be looking at. This is a really good benefit, I think, for the podcast, and hopefully, as you said, it's got to be a bipartisan issue. It has to resonate with Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and others. Otherwise, I think if this issue became partisan, it would be a disaster for any possibility to solve these problems, or at least to mitigate these. So, Dr. Teague, I really look forward to hear more about research, and also, of course, continuing the conversation about this important topic.
Great. Thank you so much.
And with that, thank you all so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Aileen Teague. If you haven't already, make sure to check out the links down in the show notes below, including our Patreon link if you'd like to support our podcast. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. And remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.